Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to talk about the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps the greatest bad boy that philosophy has ever known. Nietzsche is often caricatured as a madman or a nihilist, a bushy-mustachioed proto-Nazi Bismarckian, in any way a kind of Teutonic horror of various sorts. But these pictures are terrible misrepresentations, and they serve to keep from hearing what he has to say in an important way. And what he has to say is of tremendous significance and interest for our world today, as he himself thought it would be. Nietzsche's most famous claim, perhaps, is that God is dead. Now, it bears noting that while Nietzsche thinks this is a vastly important idea, in fact, he suspects that in his time, he is alone, pretty much alone, in realizing the magnitude of what has happened. In Nietzsche's telling of this story in his book, The Gay Science, the madman who says God is dead in the square of the city is just mocked and laughed at by the people around him. He's shocked at their indifference. But then he realizes something. And in this you can see Nietzsche himself speaking. This prodigious event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. Nietzsche thought that we had killed God, you and I, he says. And the magnitudes of the changes that are underway here because of this death are vast. But we don't yet realize what they will require of us, though one day we will. Because of all this, beneath his philosophizing, Nietzsche in some important way thinks of himself as fundamentally a prophet, telling us what these changes will mean. Once we have killed God, once we give up the idea that morality is given to us by the world or the deity himself, then we have to think about how to live beyond that belief, beyond a belief in God, as Nietzsche will say, beyond the language of good and evil. And what we need to come to is a new language of human striving, a new language of human effort, a new language in which to live, a language that is, again, as the title suggests, beyond good and evil, and especially, as we'll see, beyond the word evil. Explaining what it means to be beyond the word evil is our aim here in this lecture. I want to explain what Nietzsche wants us to do in getting so beyond good and evil, to suggest how he thinks we can live beyond those categories, and to explain why Nietzsche thinks that so getting beyond these categories, beyond these words, beyond our captivity to these words, may be the crucial next step in human evolution. Let me give you some simple biographical information about Nietzsche. Some of this information you may have heard in some vague way, but it's useful to have it all down in one place. He was born in 1844 to a Lutheran minister father and a quite strict mother. He was a brilliant student. From an early age, he was recognized as remarkably acute and intelligent. At the age of 24, a remarkably, astonishingly young age, he was appointed full professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. He held the post for 11 years before resigning due to health problems. His was an academic career that was stifled because he simply wouldn't work within the confines of what his field decided was acceptable scholarly work. Now, of course, if he had done that, a few of his works might still today be cited as secondary or even tertiary sources in philological scholarship. But instead, he didn't do that. He didn't stay within the confines of his discipline. He was mocked and abused for it, and his works are now some of the most assigned in college classrooms and among the most engaged in philosophical, religious, and literary studies. So maybe his aborted scholarly career was only aborted from a particular and particularly narrow point of view. From 1879, when he resigned, until 1889, he lived the life of an independent writer and scholar, subsisting on his pension and writing furiously. Illness, which had been persistent throughout his life, became slowly worse over this time. He suffered tremendously debilitating migraine headaches, some of them lasting 3 or 4 days, and a number of other maladies that caused him never to be a fully healthy person, ironically, given the preeminence of health in his own thinking. In 1887, he discovered the work of Dostoevsky, in whom he recognized a powerful intellect writing in fiction the ideas that he had been working out in nonfiction, or so he thought. And just as for Dostoevsky, if there is no God, as he famously says, then everything is permitted. Dostoevsky explores that in one direction. Nietzsche appreciates the magnitude of Dostoevsky's realization of that significant fact. But he didn't have a lot of time to appreciate and explore Dostoevsky's works further, because in 1889, he went completely insane in the city of Turin, Italy, when he was only 45. He was brought back to Switzerland, hospitalized, and never wrote another word until his death in 1900. Now, Nietzsche is hard to figure out. I don't think I understand him yet. It's not clear to me that I ever will understand him. In fact, I'm not even sure that he wanted to be understood in the sense of having his thought be perfectly transparent to another intellect. I think he wanted more to provoke and inspire, to agitate and excite, not to offer something that could ever be fully cognitively digested. But I may be wrong about that. Again, I'm not sure I really understand him. But, and this is, I think, very important, the lack of understanding I feel with respect to Nietzsche is a kind of achievement, I think. I'm not trying to be self-congratulatory here. It's just the product of some really hard work to get into the details of what he's trying to do. It's not the incomprehension of meeting Nietzsche for the first time, but of rather trying to struggle with the surface of the text, and after that struggle, still being bewildered at what is going on beneath the surface of that text. I want to say this to you as both a kind of consolation and a goad, because understanding Nietzsche the first time is very hard, but he's well worth struggling with. Just don't ever assume that that struggle will ever end. Now, for our purposes, Nietzsche's main argument is that morality, the system that we organize our world in to identify and name and categorize all the possible actions we could do as either good or evil, is not only simply incorrect, he thinks that's obvious, to him anyway, but it in fact serves no useful purpose any longer in our world. As we'll see, Nietzsche's argument spills out of a kind of moral argument into psychology, and then from a proposal to rearrange human psychology, it becomes a profoundly revolutionary argument across all dimensions of life in ways that we have not yet fully come to grips with. Nietzsche once called himself and his works a destiny, the destiny of Europe. And every time we go back to read Nietzsche again, he seems more and more prescient, more and more correct, that he was in fact our destiny. Now his work, and especially his book, Beyond Good and Evil, argues here that morality is simply something we need now to jettison, something we need to get past. We need to get past it because it constrains us in problematic ways, restricts our will, and punishes us in ways that we now need to transcend. Why is that? Why does a morality of good and evil no longer serve any purpose? And how is that? How did that happen? These are the questions that in some ways Nietzsche explores really in this book. Understanding his answers to this rest on understanding his rejection of the assumptions that we take for granted, Nietzsche thinks. Most fundamentally, Nietzsche challenges us to think about the purpose of truth, the concepts of good and evil, how these concepts are all related to each other. And he suggests that all these concepts, which we think of as kind of naturally part of the world, are not in fact applicable to the world as we find it, but they are instruments of our own devising, which have served the world that we have convinced ourselves we inhabit. They're tools that we use, the language of good and evil, the language of truth, the assumption we have that we need to inquire into truth. These are all tools that have now outlived their usefulness for us because now we've reached a stage of development where they are in some sense not as fruitful for us to employ. They've served a purpose for us in convincing us that the world is in fact organized by these categories, but he thinks now that they are not, that the world is not. He gets at this from the beginning by challenging a certain conception of what philosophy is. His book's famous first sentence, "Supposing truth is a woman, what then?" That's in fact a really interesting philosophical and philological joke. Because in Greek, the word philosophy, right, comes from philosophia. It means the love of wisdom. Sophia is a female noun. In other words, Nietzsche is saying, what if we actually believe what we say we believe? What if we actually believe that philosophers are supposed to love a woman? Now, the idea here is that we should not just be interested in getting the truth through, say, a scientific method. We have to seduce the truth. We have to seduce life in order to get what we want. Nietzsche thinks this is the true meaning of philosophy. There is a seductive, romantic, even a sexual connotation to what philosophy really is. Now, this is a very macho way of putting this, but we can put it in a way that isn't quite as sexist as Nietzsche in his own time did. He really wants us to think about the pursuit of a meaningful life, which is what he sees as the true point of philosophy, as a seduction, a vital activity in which we are betting our hearts, not just our minds, not just our intellects, and which if we win joy and love, and which if we lose is not only an intellectual failing, in some sense, we break our hearts. And the reason for emphasizing this serious engagement, this existentially gripping engagement, is really quite simple. The human is an animal, Nietzsche thinks, who uses language and thought to make its way in the world. Nietzsche is very Darwinian. He's someone who has appropriated and understood the implications, at least as he understands them, of Darwin's evolutionary view of the world and of humans. And he thinks of humans as fundamentally animals with a certain broader set of skills and a repertoire of abilities that other animals don't have, but effectively still subject to evolutionary constraints. The problem, he thinks, is that the skills and abilities we have, particularly in terms of the language we've developed, actually have trapped us in a certain unhealthy position now. And the primary surface manifestation of the problem we face is our continued captivity to the language of good and evil. Now, I've talked a lot about language here, and that's very important because this is a really crucial dimension of Nietzsche. In some ways, a little bit like Hobbes, Nietzsche wants to say that much of our ethical thinking turns out to be linguistically shaped. Not just linguistically shaped, but in some ways linguistically created. So if Hobbes was in some ways the first social constructivist, Nietzsche really takes this in a really quite radical way. He wants to say that in using language, we are always vulnerable to forgetting that the words we use are our words, and we are always tempted to impute to them a spurious metaphysical credibility, which they in no way actually possess. The language of good and evil is a language, and Nietzsche is a philologist here, a scholar of languages. He knows this. It's a language that emerges out of a certain cultural context, a certain background. Not everybody had a category of evil. We've already seen this, that the category of evil in a certain way develops over time, over history. And Nietzsche wants to say that these categories, good and evil, derive, just like other categories like God and sin and Satan, from human efforts to live in the world. And now, this is where Nietzsche gets really interesting. Centrally, the language of good and evil derives from the attempts, he thinks, of some humans to keep others in line, to kind of suppress their more enthusiastic energies. This is the famous slave morality's domination over the truly noble people of our world. And let me step back here and explain this a little bit more. For Nietzsche, he thinks that much of human civilization is a development of people trying to figure out how to live together and realizing that there are a few people, the truly noble souls, the noble spirits, who are so much more gifted than the ordinary run of plain humans, that they're able to kind of dominate the rest of us. Nietzsche thinks that over time, the weak people, the slaves, in fact end up feeling resentful about this domination and disliking it. Of course they would dislike it. So over time, the slaves develop a picture of the world that allows them to say that this kind of domination is bad, this kind of domination is evil. This slave morality basically is a morality that works for people who are weak and who can't do these things. But Nietzsche thinks for noble people, there's no reason why they shouldn't try to do these things. There's no reason why, if someone has a kind of excess of energy, intellectual gifts, athletic capacity, they ought not to explore and exploit those gifts to their fullest extent. The greatest achievement of human history, Nietzsche thinks, so far, has been the slave morality's triumph for humans. That is, the ability of the weak in human history to convince the strong, the truly strong, that they should obey the rules that the weak live by. Now, there's a little irony here that's worth noting, which is, of course, Nietzsche notes this, but he's not very comfortable with it, so he moves on very quickly. That if the slaves actually manage to convince the strong that they really ought to obey the ethic of the slaves, are the strong really the strong? I mean, maybe they're muscular, but they don't seem very smart, right? Somehow, there's some kind of tension here between the rhetoric Nietzsche has of the truly strong versus the weak, and the fact that he has to explain that somehow the truly strong have been suckered into this in some complicated way. But leave that aside for right now. Think about how, for Nietzsche, the language of good and evil, and again, especially the language of evil, manages to suppress humans, to keep them down, to keep them ordered in a certain way. Well, the language does this, most basically, by making the central moral issue for ethics guilt and the avoidance of guilt. Nietzsche thought the main moral issue for people caught in the language of good and evil is the struggle to avoid getting blamed for things, getting evil attached to them. And I think psychologically, this actually has some purchase on our lives. It's worth asking yourself, when you think about the world and you think about the ethical choices you have in the world, do you sometimes not catch yourself asking the question, not what is the good thing to do here, or what is the right thing to do here, but rather, what is the thing to do here that will help me avoid blame in this situation? What is the thing that most adroitly enables me to avoid feeling guilty? Nietzsche thinks asking those questions, asking how we are to avoid negative feelings, negative emotions, negative judgments, is in some important way unhealthy and destructive of ourselves. We should always be asking, what is the good thing to do? What is the beautiful thing to do? What is the truly expressive and noble thing to do? And that's why he proposes that the language of evil, which again oppresses humans and confines us in a certain way on his reading of the language, that language be replaced with a different language, one less freighted with the heavy theological connotations that evil is, right? Because, at least because evil has these connotations due to its relationship to demonic illusions, the notion of Satan, these sorts of things. Instead, he wants to say, we don't want a language of evil anymore, we want a more pragmatic language, a language of bad. In Beyond Good and Evil, he says, look, in getting beyond good and evil, I don't mean to be getting beyond good and bad. I don't mean to be punting on the idea of there being an evaluative framework to assess the successfulness or the fruitfulness of our actions. We need that. We'll always need some way of judging whether what we're doing is wise or not. In fact, I, Nietzsche, need that in making this case at all. But in talking about a language of good or bad, we have to find some other more authentically organic basis on which to ground that language to talk about the fruitfulness of actions for our lives. And Nietzsche thinks, again following Darwin, that one very powerful way of organizing that language would be around the language of health. He asks in Beyond Good and Evil, he says, we have to ask to what extent an action is life-promoting, life-preserving, even species-cultivating. That's the criteria we want to use. How do we cultivate our lives? How do we cultivate our species? If we attack the fundamental metaphysical faith, the faith in opposed values such as good and evil, we can see that the real problem with that dichotomy, good and evil, is that it serves to keep humans stuck in particular stale patterns, ruts of behavior, and constrains the development and the exercise of their power, their intellectual power, their physical power, in unhealthy ways. Why is that? Because it is unhealthy, because it basically paralyzes humans, forces us not to exercise the full range of our capacities, not to ask fundamental questions because we're afraid that they will expose certain kinds of forbidden knowledge, not to explore certain kinds of relationships or certain kinds of actions in the world because we are terrified that in some sense by doing that we will be contaminated or corrupted in some irredeemable way. Nietzsche thinks this is all crazy. Humans are, more than anything else, explorers. And if we are trapped beneath the heavy weight of an external standard that has nothing necessarily to do with our own lives, where we are right now, we're never going to be able to figure out where we will be in the future. To see how radical the change is Nietzsche wants, we have to appreciate the range of things he thinks that need to change if we want to become more healthy in this way. Right? So by changing the language of good and evil, that's a pretty substantial change on its own. But Nietzsche thinks actually there are far larger changes there as well. Sometimes in my classes, I'll talk about how philosophical or theological argument can sometimes be akin to a chess game. Making a move with one piece on one part of the board can seem like a relatively finite move on a finite kind of range of the board. You know, if you move your knight in a certain way, certain squares become vulnerable to attack, and other squares are now protected from attack. But what Nietzsche shows us, and what attention to any philosopher or theologian will show you, is that a move over in this part of the board actually affects things way over here in ways that are not entirely immediately visible. You have to understand the whole board, the whole scope of the argument to see what's going on. And not just at the present. You have to think about how this move might affect things on this part of the board 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 moves from now. By moving your knight up here, maybe you've exposed a bishop in a certain way. By moving your knight up here, maybe you've rendered another knight more susceptible to attack. Or now you've loosened pieces that can now go and attack over here. But it'll take 10 moves to get there. The same thing happens in philosophy and in theology. An argument at one place in a philosophical system or a proposal will actually affect things remarkably and dramatically elsewhere in the system. That's what Nietzsche's proposal about getting beyond good and evil actually does. Now, to understand the details of this argument, we have to ask 4 basic questions. First, what is the will to truth? What does Nietzsche think of nature? That's the second question. What is nature for Nietzsche? Third, what does Nietzsche think of the standard whereby we should judge things better or worse? And finally, what exactly is the will to power? So let's talk about challenging truth here. Nietzsche wants to challenge in a quite radical way our sense that being true is a naturally good thing for us to want. Truth is something we can interrogate to see if we believe in it anymore. We can challenge, he says, our captivity to what he calls the will to truth, our unstated assumption, at an almost reflexive level, that seeking truth as an objective reality outside of us is in fact innate and good. That if nothing, if our thoughts do not generate some kind of evidence from the outside that they might be true, that they're probably false. Nietzsche thinks that's crazy. For Nietzsche, we need to turn on the will to truth itself and inquire into whether it is healthy, whether it is good for us. And when we do that, we will see that, as Nietzsche puts it, the problem with the will to truth is that it assumes the world is opposed in structures of opposites. And Nietzsche thinks that no such tidy opposition exists in nature. There, in nature, sometimes what we call good is intimately related to what we call evil, and intimately related in ways that should give us cause to reflect on them more thoroughly. This is speaking of the whole range of cases that philosophers talk about as dirty hands cases, cases of ethical behavior where to do some great good, something must be done that looks evil or at least approaches evil. Even where the good thing may vastly outweigh the evil thing that needs to be done, philosophers have a lot of trouble figuring out how to justify the evil, even though the good is done as well. Nietzsche would have people not worry about that so much. We often do evil things, but don't notice that we'd thought of them as evil. We would think of them as evil in a different setting. We would think of normally sticking a child with a needle as an evil thing to do. But when we're doing it in the context of giving the child a vaccination, causing pain for their health, we think of that as a good thing. Instead of thinking of the will to truth, Nietzsche wants us to think of humans as fundamentally, again, animals. Our thinking is not the cogitation of a computer, a free-floating, immaterial mind or soul. Our thinking derives from our belly and our muscles, our appetites and our aversions, our consciousness and our inquiries into the world. Those are the things, the existentially gripping things that drive our thinking. Now, what Nietzsche uses to destabilize truth here, the lever he uses to pry it out of the floor of consciousness, the assumptions that are base that we never even question, is in fact, again, this vision of health, of the human as an animal who uses language to help it make its way in the world. The question we have to ask of any actual practice humans engage in is about whether or not it is cultivating of us. We need fictions, it turns out, Nietzsche thinks, because fictions do cultivate us. We need to know how to transcend the stories we tell. And for that, sometimes we need to convince ourselves of things that are not yet true. Right? That in fact, we are now able to build this castle. We are now able to build this tower up to God. That would not have been true, Nietzsche thinks, before we try to build those things. But the ambition itself creates the ability, he thinks. So he says, famously, to recognize untruth as a condition for life, to imagine that you can do something and then to strive and accomplish it, that is a crucial, crucial fact. And he says, a philosophy that risks recognizing untruth as a condition for life would by that token alone place itself beyond good and evil. All that is to say that we are not interested in getting the truth, simply put, through, that is, using the scientific method. We have to seduce reality to get what we want. We have to seduce life to get what we want. Remember again, supposing truth is a woman. Imagine if, in fact, philosophy is an effort of sexual seduction. But this raises questions about what nature is for Nietzsche. What does it mean to live naturally? Well, nature is, in some ways, the activity that is involved in self-overcoming. Again, this is very Darwinian. Nature is a struggle, a striving, an overcoming of the moment for something greater than the moment. As he says, the human is the as yet undetermined animal. The human is the creature whose nature is not yet fully known, is in some sense open to the human to determine. And in a way, philosophy itself is the energy that can help the human determine that. Philosophy itself is, as he says, the most tyrannical drive the human has, the most spiritual will to power. Nature is an energy that is seeking ever new forms of expression. The human is a vessel for that energy, a structure that is also seeking ever new forms of expression. That means that the forms that we have at any moment are always going to be broken apart in the new expression of the energy that is coming. Nature, then, is a kind of endless, energetic, destructive creativity. Everything we are turns out to be a tumult of energy. The actions we engage in, Nietzsche says, are a matter of more discharge, of expression of our energy, more often than they are really oriented towards some finite goal that we have set in the future, right? We should avoid thinking that everything we do with a particular end in mind. Nature, in this way, is what Nietzsche famously calls the will to power. Now, just to stop here for a second, the will to power is a translation of a German word, the Will zur Macht, right? Now, the Will zur Macht is really it's fairly translated as the will to power. But in fact, it's not simply fair to call it only the will to power. It also is, in a certain way, related to the will to create, to make. See, Macht is not just power, it's also machen, to make. And Nietzsche actually has a romantic edge, and I mean that the romantic movement, not a kind of romantic comedies or romantic novels. He has a romantic edge, a focus on the human as creative, which is really quite important to get in him. He's not really a Bismarckian, interested in walking around Europe with an iron fist and smashing people. He's interested in the idea that in every dimension of life, politics too, but every dimension of life, philosophy, science, art, there's an expressive and dynamic creativity that needs to be cultivated. And this is a little bit like Marx. Remember Marx's idea that humans are, in some sense, needing to find the way to find their happiness in their expression of their energies. Nietzsche, too, thinks that this expression of energy is really crucial. Now, this will to power, though, there's a question about it, and this gets at the kind of the basis of what we could call Nietzsche's metaphysics. We want to call it that. Is the will to power something we're in charge of? Are we the ones discharging this will, or are we what is discharged? The psychology that Nietzsche offers has to understand the will to power as, in some ways, a really fundamental force moving through the world, challenging us, challenging our own conception of ourselves as people who are in charge of us. We need, that is, Nietzsche thinks, if we are to get beyond good and evil, a new psychology, a new way of thinking about our own notion of autonomy here. Now, does Nietzsche think that this discharge affects only our doing, or does it affect our thinking as well? Both, obviously. And this is to say something of the depth of the radical reformation of the point and purpose of our lives that this picture demands. Now, getting us this far pushes us, as he himself puts it in the title of one of his works, towards a genealogy of morals. Once we understand the need to get beyond good and evil, we have to step back and understand just what it is towards which we are going. And in this way, there is a kind of anthropological revolution at the heart of Nietzsche's aims. Again, we need to rethink this notion that we are properly autonomous, separate creatures. We have to change our understanding of ourselves, not just the content of what we understand ourselves to be, but also for Nietzsche, the nature of what we take to be understanding itself. We have to take a new stance towards ourselves in some radical way. Nietzsche needs new ideas about the soul as a multiplicity of creatures, the soul as segmented in complicated ways, in order to get at this new dynamism of the will to power that he thinks is actually motivating human agency. A soul that is most fundamentally something we can understand, not as good or evil, but as healthy or sick. And in a way, that language itself replaces, if that's the word for it, the language of good and evil. Now, this anthropological revolution is a revolution for our psychologies, for how we think of ourselves and how we live into the future. When we think about this, we are understanding that this rejection of good and evil for Nietzsche is a rejection really on Darwinist grounds. But unlike Darwin, who he thought was caught in the will to truth, who he thought was caught in telling a story that Darwin believed was objectively true about the world, Nietzsche thinks Darwin is actually offering us a way of imagining ourselves in a new way. And that's what Nietzsche wants to do. He wants to say that instead of thinking about this just as the truth, when we think about what it means to kill God, it means not just that it is true that God is dead. It means that in some sense, we're beyond the very category of thinking about what's true and not true. That's how you really kill God. That's how you really get beyond good and evil. Not so much by proving that these things don't exist, but by no longer caring about whether or not they exist at all.